Today we're going to be talking about Sherlock Holmes and the stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. We are also going to be talking some about the history of especially the 19th century and the way in which it sets the stage for the 20th century. My slides online actually start with the historical material and then finish with Sherlock Holmes, but I thought actually today I might do it in the opposite order. That way we can be sure to get to the story and then we'll fit in one of the history we can get through today and we'll go through the rest next time. So, let me start by saying that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle lived, as you can see, from 1859 to 1930. He spanned both centuries. He was, in some ways, a creature of the 19th century, and yet also is writing these fabulously popular stories right at the end, in the 1890s, and then in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Sherlock Holmes is a figure of enduring interest and has inspired all sorts of other literary treatments. Doyle tried at various points to kill off Holmes, and then that was so unpopular with both his publisher and with the public that he brought Holmes back and had another series of stories. So there was a freestanding novel. There were, I think, 4 collections of Holmes stories. They were often published in magazines in a sort of serial format, and they were a genre in sort of popular literature that you might see as a forerunner of today's television shows or other kinds of serial things like that. Now, part of what makes, oh here, photographs of Doyle from a trip that he made to the United States. What makes Sherlock Holmes such a remarkable figure? And what makes Dr. Watson, his companion, such an appealing figure? Well, as you can see, it's inspired lots of different literary treatments and various works of art, theater productions and all sorts of things. Here's one current TV show inspired by this. Here's another. And actually, House, M.D., was also inspired by the Sherlock Holmes stories. It was just the same thing in a medical setting. Now, what makes Holmes so singular? What makes Holmes so unusual? A lot of you are probably familiar with Holmes from other settings, but if not, at least from the story we read from today. Tell me about Sherlock Holmes. Describe it for me.
Rational.
Rational, exactly. Holmes is highly rational, right? In fact, rationality seems to be his chief character trait. Holmes is above all rational, somebody who applies reason to every problem. What else? Yes? Good, observant. He is somebody who observes things that other people do not observe. Holmes, looking at me, would undoubtedly, without knowing anything else about me, be able to say all sorts of things. In fact, let's let you play Sherlock Holmes for a minute. I mean, you're cheating. You know I'm a college professor. But just take a look at me. What could you deduce purely from my appearance about me?
Professional.
That I'm a professional? Okay, good.
Look at the shoes.
Look at the shoes. Ooh. Yeah, look at those shoes. I don't know what they imply about me. What they imply about me.
Rugged and sporting.
Rugged and sporting, I like it. Yeah, well, I mean, come on, don't be shy. I'm used to people saying all sorts of terrible things about me. I'm married.
You were in a hurry.
I was in a hurry.
Very passionate.
Oh dear. Yeah, well, it doesn't really get any better than this, I have to tell you, but what else?
Your socks match.
My socks match? Oh, you weren't supposed to be able to see them. Yes.
You're generally very happy.
Very joking.
Oh, yeah, you can tell by the, right, if you look at a young person's face, you might think you can tell all sorts of things about their personality just from their appearance. It seems to me often you really can't. But by the time you get to be my age, you probably can, because there are certain patterns of somebody's face. You can tell how often they've been smiling, how often they've been frowning, how often they've wrinkled my brow. Though pay no attention to the line there. I've had that since I was 12. Either I was a particularly disturbed and troubled boy, or it's just, actually what it is I have a Neanderthal-shaped forehead. It very much goes in and out, so that line's been more or less always there. But yes, you can tell just something about my personality from the lines in my face. Am I usually smiling? Am I usually frowning? Am I yelling at students, get out of this classroom? No, I mean, you can tell something about that just from looking at me. Other things you might be able to tell about me. Yeah?
You're very physical hands.
Yeah, I'm moving my hands all the time, right? In fact, one of the most difficult things I had to do in doing that MOOC, that massively open online version of this very course, was to stand in one place and not wave my hands. I had a mark and I had to stay on my mark. And that's really hard. I mean, to just stand there stationary for 20 minutes, I mean, maybe that would be hard for you. It was really hard for me, because I'm usually moving around and waving my hands around. And what else? Well, even standing up, I started doing this. They said, that's weird. I mean, you look, you're just like hopping over, right? And so I had to actually stand like this, so if I swayed, I would sway backwards and forward and not freak out the viewer in the same way. But yeah, that's hard for me. I'm always moving around. One time, the doctor examined me, this was many years ago in Pittsburgh, and said, you're kind of a hyper guy. My reaction was, what do you mean hyper? I'm not hyper. I've just been waiting in your waiting room for 4 hours. That's why I'm hyper. But actually, I sort of am. What else?
You're very honest.
I'm very honest. How can you tell?
You don't brush your lips and your nose is moved. You don't brush your nose.
Oh, I like it. Yes. Yes, actually, I am a very honest guy. The dean I used to work for when I was a department chair used to describe me as a straight shooter. And I do think of that as one of my virtues. I'm honest, sometimes maybe a little too honest. I used to tell students then, I'll never lie to you, but I sometimes won't tell you the truth. And that sounds like some kind of weird prevarication, but actually, especially a department chair is often in that position. It's kind of like, yeah, I can't talk about that. It's some personnel matter. It's confidential. There are things I can't discuss with you, but I'll never lie to you about anything. I'll just tell you I can't talk about that. And so yeah, I like to think that's true. Anything else you can tell about me, just from appearances?
If you hadn't told us you were married, we wouldn't know.
That's true. You probably wouldn't know I was married, except that I said I'm used to hearing bad things about myself. Yeah, and why not? Partly is, actually, I'm allergic to all. I used to wear a wedding ring, but it makes my fingers puff up and so on, and so I don't wear any bling of any kind. Partly because it freaks out my skin, and so yeah, you can't really tell I'm married or other things like that. I can't wear my Super Bowl ring or anything. What else?
This doesn't necessarily mean you're old, but you have gray hair. Yeah.
Okay, good. I have gray hair, and that tells something about me, right? I mean,
You could be stressed out a lot.
yeah, I carefully dye it this way, look more distinguished. No, right, I mean, that allows you to infer a certain amount about me. It's interesting, I'm a weird cross. One grandfather had lost all his hair by the time he was 40. He was totally bald. And the other grandfather never got gray. He was in his mid-90s when he died, actually his later 90s, and he just never got gray. And so I'm unfortunate. Well, the good news is I still have my hair. The bad news is that it went gray. So anyway, but yeah, that allows you to infer something about my age. Anything else? Play Sherlock Holmes a little further. Yeah.
You're tan, so you do more than like age.
Oh, I'm tan. Yes, that's right. So I am outside quite a lot. Yeah, you can infer that. And in that way, I'm not sort of a typical professor who spends all his time in the library. Anything else? Yeah.
You're neat because your clothes are like starched and like they're ironed.
Ooh, I'm neat because my clothes look actually starched and ironed and stuff. That's because the pants are new. It won't be that way for long, I assure you. So a reasonable deduction, but in this case a misleading circumstance. Yeah, that was one thing that was awesome when I was doing the massively open online course. I had someone there who actually ironed the shirts and ironed the pants before I put them on. I had like a little dressing room, and I had someone there who committed and she picked out ties and everything. She was like my personal sartorial assistant because she took one look at the clothes I usually wear and just said, that will do it. Dreams rescue. So anyway, here I'm back to my own style. This is kind of the real me. She had me wear all these gray shirts and other things that made me feel weird. All right, well anyway, Sherlock Holmes presumably would come up with this stuff and do much better. Would tell you whether I have any pets and how many. Would be able to infer all sorts of things about details about me. Would be able to infer something about my ethnicity and a variety of other things probably, just from looking at me. And that's kind of a remarkable thing, right? And so he manages to do this by, in part, observing all sorts of things that other people do not observe. And how does he do it? Well, one thing that Watson stresses in the stories, he says, Look, Holmes is supremely rational. He doesn't let emotion interfere with his judgment and with his observation. You and I tend to observe a few things, but often we really observe only a few things about people. And in fact, it is astounding how little we observe. In fact, they did experiments some time ago about inattention. And they started with people coming into a university office and asking for a form. What would happen is that they would make the request of one student, sort of a work study person, who would then go down behind the counter, and then coming up to hand them the form was a completely different person. And they found that nobody noticed. Now, admittedly, the variations were not very wide. These tended to be student, age and appearance and so forth. So they said, well, let's make it more extreme. So they did some of these outside, where people would ask directions, and then someone would come through carrying a door or a painting or something. And they found that nobody really noticed the difference when that person sort of carried off the door and another person was standing there. They decided to see how far they could push this, because in the initial experiments, it was all roughly middle-aged white guys. And so they said, well, what if we have middle-aged white women? Well, that works too. What if a woman now is in place of a man, or vice versa? Nobody noticed. What if someone who is black replaces somebody who is white, or vice versa? Or, a tall black guy is suddenly replaced by a small Asian woman. Nobody notices. It's absolutely astounding. It's like, wait, how can people not notice that? But people are like, oh, the replacement is, oh, okay, you were trying to get to the engineering building, right? It's like, it doesn't make any difference. So most of us are incredibly inobservant most of the time. Now, one thing that happens is that our emotions interfere. In this case, we're not very interested in the other person. It's a momentary interaction, we don't pay any attention. In other cases, we decide right away, I don't like that person, I'm just getting away from here, we don't pay much attention. But Watson says Holmes is different. All emotions, and actually the one that's involved in this story, love in particular, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has ever seen. So Holmes already is remarkable in that he is not distracted by emotion. That for the trained reasoner to admit such intrusions, that is to say emotional intrusions, into his own delicate and finely adjusted temperament, would be to introduce a distracting factor which might throw a doubt on all his mental results. So Holmes very carefully protects himself against emotion. Remember we said that in Hume, reason is not to be the slave of the passions. Well, here it's completely a different story. The passions are a slave of Holmes's reason. And so one thing we could say is precisely that contrast. Hume, we should subjugate reason to the passions, and it's exactly the opposite for Holmes. We've got to subjugate the passions to reason. Reason is not always, but really ought to be, the master of the passions. Now you might say it's even stronger than that. Plato would agree that it has to master the passions. But Holmes is more than just saying there has to be a proper balance of the soul between reason, emotion, and desire. He is really saying, no, you have to suppress emotion. Emotion can interrupt you. It can confuse you, distract you. It can becloud the mind. You've got to, in some way, suppress it in order to think fully rationally about things. That's one element, but the other element is indeed observation. At one point he says to Watson, you see, but you do not observe. The distinction is clear. Now what is the distinction? Now some of you noticed my shoes, noticed there wasn't a ring on my hand, but most of you probably didn't notice those things. Well, let's take a look at an instance here. Holmes says to Watson, for example, you've frequently seen the steps which lead up the hall to this room. Watson says, frequently. How often? Well, some hundreds of times. Then, how many hours? Watson says, how many? I don't know. So Watson says, quite so. You have not observed, and yet you have seen. That's just my point. Now, in this classroom right now, how many rows of seats are there?
One.
You've been in here several times, but you don't know, right? You'd have to sort around and count. That's observing. Actually, I think there's 14, if I'm counting correctly right now. But I didn't know that until I just counted them. And so most of us go through life, we see these things, but we never really observe them. Think about your own house at home. How many windows are there? Right? You've lived in that house maybe for a long time, but you often think, how many windows? I don't know. Right? So Holmes would say, you have seen, but you have not observed. You have not really paid attention to certain kinds of things. So he pays attention. Now the question then is, well, what do you pay attention to? There's a Chinese philosopher, Wang Yang, who lived in the 14th century and was initially a Confucian. He became a great Neo-Confucian philosopher, but one of the things that's central to Confucianism is the investigation of things, the acquisition of knowledge. And in Great Learning, the key to everything, to a well-ordered society, to ethical behavior, to having a good character, is the investigation of things. And so Wang Yang decided he would devote himself to the investigation of things. So for 1 week, he sat and watched a field of grass in order to understand the grass. He watched and he watched. The sun rose, the sun set. It rose again, set again. And what did he learn about the grass? Nothing. Okay, absolutely nothing. In which case he said, well, all right, yes, the investigation of things it's not enough to look. It's not enough to see. Now, in fact, what do you have to do to understand grass? It's not enough to just sit there and watch it and watch it and watch it for a week. You have to actually investigate in a more active way, right? You have to figure out what is fundamental. What do I really need to know? And so, here's what Holmes has as an advantage over Wang Yang. He has scientific method. And indeed, part of what you see in the Holmes stories is Holmes acting as an amateur scientist, investigating the various 243 possible types of tobacco ash, and other things like that enable him to understand it. This is actually a recreation from the stories of Holmes's place on Baker Street, and it's actually open as a museum in London. And here's his little scientific corner. Well, part of the scientific method is we don't just watch, we observe in Holmes' sense. That is to say, we ask questions. We try to seek the answers to specific sorts of questions. We attend to relevant factors. When you're just sitting there looking at a field of grass, you don't really know what's relevant and what's irrelevant. What are you looking for? What are you trying to know? The scientist doesn't just start by saying, hey, I'm going to sit around and watch grass grow. Instead, there are questions. What is happening here? And then you design experiments in order to answer the questions. So you attend to the relevant factors. You formulate hypotheses. You test those hypotheses. And then, throughout the entire thing, you remain open to new information. So it isn't just a matter of seeing. It's a matter of observing, but in a very particular and focused way. And indeed, that's what Holmes does throughout the stories. It's not just that he sees certain things that other people don't see. It's not even that he takes note of things that other people don't take notice of. He knows what to look for. Often he will say to Watson, so Watson, you try it out. Give me an independent look at this. Tell me something about this person just from this pair of shoes. And so Watson will look at the shoes and observe the kinds of things that you and I might observe. Maybe a little better, actually, because he starts getting better and better at it. But then Holmes says, very good, Watson, very good. It's led you to entirely wrong conclusions, but... and then he proceeds to give you his analysis, and he's looking at different things. It's not so much that he's seeing things that Watson didn't or couldn't see. It's rather that he has a different sense of what's relevant, what's going to give him useful information. And so he's asking different questions, noticing different things because of those different questions, and therefore drawing different conclusions. Well, in the story, a story that's really quite dramatic, I think, photography plays a special role. It starts in a way that does involve emotion. To Sherlock Holmes, she is always the woman. I've never heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion, hint of love for either matter. All emotions, and that one particularly, were important to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. But then, as the story progresses, we find out it's not just a question of emotion and controlling emotion in this sort of case. A photograph plays a key role. Now, why does it play a key role? Well, here's what happens. This king, and before he even walks in, Holmes has deduced who he must be, comes in and makes a request of Holmes. And so Holmes at one point says, I fail to follow your majesty. If this young person should produce her letters for blackmailing or other purposes, how is she to prove their authenticity? You might remember the king has had an affair with this woman, and the woman has these letters and so on, and the king is worried about this. And he's now about to be married to someone else from another royal house. A lot of politics in Europe depends on the success of their marriage, not only his personal happiness. And he's going home saying, look, all of this could be derailed by these letters that are in her possession. What do I do? Can you get them back? And so, Holmes says, look, I don't see why you're worried about letters. How could somebody produces letters? And that says, aha, here are love letters from so-and-so. Well, how can you prove they're authentic, right? They can be forged, they can be faked. And so, here is the exchange. The king says, there is the writing. Holmes says, pip, forgery. My private notepaper. Stolen. My own seal. Imitated. My photograph. What? We were both in the photograph. Oh dear. That is very bad. Your Majesty has indeed committed an indiscretion. Now, why is that so bad? What's special about a photograph? Why is the photograph so much worse than just a letter or something else? It proves they were together. Now notice your conclusion. They prove something, right? It proves they were together. Why? Okay, it's not so easy to fake a photograph successfully. Now, of course, this was pre-Photoshop. Roy will talk about this, and you'll find out it was possible to fake photographs even then. And in fact, Doyle was taken in very famously by some fake photographs. However, it was hard to fake a photograph then. It's not even that easy to do it now and get away with it. But still, people can try. Nevertheless, there's something that at least suggests that the photograph is accurate. So suppose somebody writes a story or a play, right? Someone has produced a play in which she and I have an affair. Would this be a scandal? Not really, right? I mean, well, I think that's nonfiction instead of fiction. No reason to think that is really compelling. What about a book? Someone writes a book, and in the book, the king has an affair with this woman. Again, right? Could be a work of fiction. Why does that prove anything? Suppose it's a painting. Oh, there is a painting of the two of us together. Well, big deal, right? People can paint whatever they want. I mean, painting doesn't have to correspond to reality. It might, but it might not. That doesn't correspond to anything. Who's that artist, by the way? Do you recognize that? Vasily Kandinsky, one of my favorites. You'll see him a few times throughout the course, and one of his works is on the webpage. But yes, there's something very special about the camera. Right now, I'm being photographed, right? I'm being filmed. And the presumption is that what's there actually corresponds to what's happening in the room. Now, it could be faked, and it could be edited and so on, but on the other hand, it constitutes pretty strong evidence. Why? Because there's a direct causal process there. And so one way to look at it is to say, yeah, we see a photograph like this famous photograph of the nurse and the sailor kissing on VE Day at the end of the Second World War, and the response is, well, that happened, right? Yeah, it could have been staged, could have been faked, could have been photoshopped, but actually that's strong evidence that that event really took place. Or here, we have cameras at finish lines, right? We don't have artists at finish lines drawing pictures. For one thing, they aren't as sensitive, but for another thing, the fact that they draw that person as the winner doesn't mean anything. The photograph means something different. And so similarly, we do that in all sorts of other cases. We take photographs as evidence because there's a direct causal process. Now, sometimes things go wrong. And for example, here's a photograph that I have in there just because it stinks. Okay, it doesn't portray the situation very well at all because it's poorly taken, or maybe that's the point, maybe it's meant to be that way, but in any case, it's something that doesn't portray the reality very effectively. But ordinarily, a photograph does. There's a photograph of Doyle. It indicates pretty well how Doyle looked. Now, not precisely, look at it carefully. What's wrong with it? It's worse than blurry. It's actually kind of a double exposure. Yeah, you can see the outline. It's like there were two exposures of him superimposed, and he didn't change position much, but a little bit. Okay? And so a photograph can diverge from the reality. He didn't really have that halo around his head, but it doesn't tend to diverge much. So here's one way we can put it. There's a causal process. And the normal outcome of that causal process is something that represents the world. It represents things accurately. Now, a realist thinks the same thing is true of our perceptual faculties. We usually perceive things accurately. Somebody says, was Bond back in class today? You say, yes, I saw him, I heard him, I was there. And that's ordinarily very good evidence that I was here. You could be deceived. This could be a very clever hologram, or maybe I'm an actor portraying Dan Bonavac. We get paid a lot to portray Dan Bonavac. But no, I mean, that's silly, right? No, it's not that. Really, actually, this is very good evidence. And so our perceptual faculties operate by a causal process, Not that different from the camera's causal process. Things could go wrong, things could be manipulated, but ordinarily the outcome of that process is something that's an accurate representation of the world. Well, yes, here's a quotation I'm fond of. The hard fact was circumstances rarely misled, and appearances were always full of truth. That's by a novelist who writes realistic novels about people's interaction. Actually, also, in my view, slightly interesting but slightly boring novels. However, realistic in the sense that, look, ordinarily the way things appear to you is the way they are. It's because there's a causal process that normally produces an accurate perception of the world. Now, in this case, of course, the question is the photograph, and Holmes goes to great lengths to get it back. Does he succeed? No, he fails. Now, there's an interesting question here. Does he fail because his emotions interfere? Or is it rather that he has this emotional attachment to Irene Adler because he failed? She outsmarted him. There aren't many people who outsmart Holmes throughout the entire corpus of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So, does she outsmart him because he's distracted by his emotion? Or does his emotion arise because she outsmarted him? I don't know. This is an interesting puzzle to think about in the story. But here is when he finally confirms to the king that although she has the photograph and Holmes was not able to get it back, nevertheless she's keeping it purely for insurance, so that no injustice is done to her. She has no intention of exposing this and harming the king. And here's what she says to Holmes. As to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I rather am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will, without hindrance from one who he has cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself and to preserve a weapon, which will always secure me from any steps which he might take in the future. So, she's keeping this purely as an insurance policy, purely as protection, so that she can reveal it in case the king comes after her again. Here's the king's reaction. Wonderful! Oh, wonderful! Okay? Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she have not made an admirable queen? Is it not a pity that she was not on my level? Well now, yeah, that's how Holmes reacts too. Holmes says, from what I've seen of the lady, she seems indeed to be on a very different level to your majesty. Now, Holmes is dripping with contempt for the king, really throughout the story, even before this point, and has great admiration for Irene Adler. And one of the questions I want us to think about is why? Why is he contemptuous of the king, and why is he so taken with Adler? In part, I think it comes down to a question of Doyle's ideals that he's expressing in these stories. But let's talk first of all about the king. What is it about the king that Holmes so dislikes? He's an authority figure. Now, it is true, Holmes is not very fond of authority figures throughout this. Who else in the stories might be an authority figure? Yeah, Lestrade, the police detective. He is described in the stories as the best of a bad lot. Callow, sallow-faced, rat-like. No, actually, interestingly, most of the TV representations of Lestrade make him out to be a somewhat more admirable character. And in fact, both the British Sherlock series and the American Sherlock series actually have the police detective as being quite an admirable figure. Not as bright as Holmes, but nevertheless a good person and pretty competent. In the original stories, that's really not true. Lestrade might be the best of the group, but in general, you can tell Doyle doesn't think much of authority figures, and the police are a good example, the king is another example. He's deeply distrustful of authority, and that is one of the themes that does ring true in the stories. Holmes can figure it out better than these authority figures who are generally badly confused. Other things that bother him about the king. Yeah?
He holds authority without actually being given to him.
Okay, good. He has unearned authority. He has authority that's been given to him through heredity, but he hasn't actually done anything to earn it. What's so great about this king? For what virtue was he named to that position? Well, he was the son of another king, right? In other words, he is somebody who has authority, but there's nothing about that suggests that he actually earned that through some process. Now, somebody who has their position in a hereditary fashion is a good example then of that kind of problem. It's not just that they're an authority figure and often a little bit full of themselves and often not really as competent as they think they are. It's partly that in this case, he didn't even earn that position. It's not like somebody like a police detective who actually arose to that position by excelling at lower levels, and then may or may not be so competent at that level. The king didn't have to do it. The king just sort of got there on that. So there's that. Are there other things? Yeah?
The king has different values than Holmes. The king values, like, I guess, where, you know, her level or whatever, so who she was, where she was born in society, whereas Holmes cares about intellect.
Good, exactly. He has a very different value system from Holmes. And when he says, she was not on my level, what does he mean? He's just talking about heredity, class, and so on. He is basically saying she was not born into the nobility. If only she had been a duchess. If only she had been, someone like title Bennett, wow, be a different story. She's a commoner. And so that's something clearly that Holmes has no respect for at all. Now, why does he have no respect for that kind of social position, social class, nobility of birth, etc.? Yeah?
As far as nobility is concerned, because it's not earned. Holmes himself is smarter and more apt, as far as he's concerned, to do most of these things. But this man is king, is leading a nation. He was taken into the wondrous how was he fit to lead an entire country.
Okay, good. There are several ideas there. One idea is, look, Holmes believes in intelligence, he believes in work, he believes in merit. Now, he seems in the story to value intelligence and rationality above all else, but actually he clearly admires Watson and wants Watson there as a companion, partly because Watson fills in the parts that he feels are missing in his own personality. And so it's not that he values only intelligence, but he does value merit. And he basically thinks anybody could do the kind of things he could do if only they paid attention. At least they could get a lot better. And so he is at some level an egalitarian. He thinks, look, it's a matter of what you can do and a matter of what you actually do. But in addition to that, he's somebody then who thinks it's a question of merit, really. What do you deserve? Does the king deserve his position? What gives him the right to rule over all these people? Well, you're right. The answer is nothing. He doesn't actually have any corresponding merit that entitles him to that position. And so Holmes looks at him and says, basically, not only is it unearned in the way you got it, but it seems unearned in the sense that you don't really seem like a terribly intelligent or hardworking or admirable figure. And so you don't have the merit that should go along with this position. Now, we can get a sense then of Holmes as a kind of Enlightenment ideal. Somebody who believes in those theses of the Enlightenment that we were talking about earlier, but also extends that to a kind of egalitarian conception, something that is also present in the Enlightenment, even though we didn't talk about the dimension much. Remember our first thesis, truth. There are truths that are absolute, independent of any individual mind, and are thus universal. Crime genres in general promote this view of the truth. Why? Because somebody did it, right? The postmodernists cannot easily write a crime novel, or a crime story, or produce a crime series on TV. Why? Well, because in the end, we'll get to postmodernism much later, but it rejects realism and all these other theses, and so it suggests that truth is in the eye of the beholder. Who did it? Who committed the murder? Well, depends. Whoever you think committed it is. It's hard to get a good crime story going, a good mystery, right? Who did it? Oh, in the end, it's just whoever you think. No, come on, somebody did it, right? If this person was murdered, somebody actually murdered them. Don't tell me it's whoever I think. And so, in a sense, the whole genre depends on this idea that there's a truth. In this case, the truth revealed by the photograph, and also revealed by Holmes' very clever trick of finding out where the photograph is. But, yes, he thinks there is truth, and moreover, that it is possible to know it. In a way, Holmes' whole principle is that not only is it true that somebody did this, or that the photographs are hidden in some particular place, but you can figure it out. It is possible for you to gain knowledge of at least some of the truths. And you do that by the application of reason. So that brings us to the third thesis. Reason's the best way of uncovering those truths. And that's what Holmes is doing. He is there as an embodiment of the Enlightenment, saying you follow rational practices. Subjugate your emotions, subjugate desire to what really seems to be driven by the facts. Right? Well, you remember, gosh, I remember from the old days, the crime show on TV, where Sergeant Fry used to, well, actually, I don't think he ever said this in the series, but the slogan was, just the facts, man, just the facts. Because he's talking to somebody who's a witness, and just, oh, it was horrible, just the facts, man, just the facts. Okay? And In a way, Holmes is saying, yeah, respond to the facts. Figure out the facts, gain knowledge, ask the right questions, observe the relevant things, and then draw the right conclusions from them using reason. Well, finally, people acting rationally in that way is the best way of achieving our aims. In Holmes's case, obviously, because he's trying to figure out who did it, or in this case, where the photographs are. He's trying to find out something, and this is the best way to do it. And so the stories reveal that as a general pattern. Look, the way to figure these things out, to make progress, to not only uncover the truth, but to get somewhere, is to use rational methods. In addition to this, there is that other Enlightenment dimension, the Enlightenment dimension that's reflected in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Here you get something similar. Look, anybody is capable of rational action. Everybody is capable of following Holmes's methods, of applying reason, of trying to avoid the interference of emotion. Now, people may be better or worse at it. Some people may have highly developed abilities, others not. Maybe some are more intelligent than others. But overall, anybody is capable of moving in the direction of what he's recommending. Anybody could be better off and more Holmes-like than they already are. And so he thinks, look, it's not that only he and his brother are so intelligent they can apply his methods. No, this is the right method for anyone. Anybody's going to be able to do better by using reason in order to find objective truth. But merit does matter. In the end, it matters how good you are. And so what makes Holmes cocky and look down on people like Lestrade and others in the police force? Well, it's the fact that he is more competent. He's better at it. And so merit matters. In the end, what should determine your status in society, your place, the amount of respect you receive from others, is how good you are at doing what you do. It's not a question of deserving it because of this or that other thing. It's a matter of actually deserving it because you excel at it. And so he stands for merit, stands for excellence. So why does he hate the king? And why does he admire Adler? Partly because she's really good at what she does. She outsmarts him, and partly because the king seems rather dull-witted and not nearly up to Holmes's level. But part of it, here I'm not talking about social level, I just mean intellectual level, but part of it is that Adler has no such presuppositions, right? She actually excels at what she does. She is also somebody who has no intent to harm anyone. Whereas the king, not only has treated her very badly, but in addition to that, clearly has no interest in what happens in order to get those letters back. He's somebody who operates without much of a moral sense, whereas Irene Adler seems like a good person, a moral person, and Holmes admires that. It is, by the way, weird that both the British series and the American series, when they finally got to the Irene Adler story, they each independently had her end up in league with Moriarty, Holmes' great enemy. There's nothing in Doyle that supports that. That is an imaginative flight of fantasy that some of us, well, actually just me, finds horrifying. Adler is the woman. You can't have the woman defect to the other side. Well, anyway, never mind. Now, so here is one thing I want us to note about Doyle and Holmes themselves. First of all, there's a sort of thesis of realism underlying this. What I mean by that is that the facts are independent of our thinking. That is to say, there are some features of the world, some truths that are really independent of the mind. There are things that are really that way out there, no matter what anybody believes about them, thinks about them, feels about them, etc. The world is, at least in some of its dimensions, independent of us. Now, not in all of its dimensions, obviously. Thoughts, feelings, desires, those are parts of the world too, and they depend on minds. But there are facts about the world that don't depend on minds, and don't depend on the way people feel or think about them. A second is individualism. Holmes acts independently of everybody else. The police are doing their thing, he often sends Watson off to do his thing, but Holmes then acts independently. He goes off and does his own thing individually. He isn't just a team player. People often say there is no I in team. Well, Holmes is all in favor of the I as opposed to the team. He is happy to assign other tasks to other people, and he does rely on certain people throughout the stories. Nevertheless, he acts independently. He has his own ideas and he pursues them independently. Another, well, we've already talked about this, the distrust of authority, revealed in his attitude toward the king, toward Lestrade, etc. There's also a tragic vision here. What do I mean by that? There are trade-offs that Holmes has to make. These stories sometimes are wrapped up neatly, and yay, the bad guy is caught and put away, the good guy is saved, it's all wonderful. But often that doesn't happen. Sometimes Holmes doesn't actually come up with the answer. Sometimes he makes mistakes and then later has to realize he's made a mistake and correct himself. And so one thing that we have to recognize here is, first of all, Holmes has to make choices. There are trade-offs, and sometimes he has to give up one thing in order to gain another thing. It is not easy. It's not as if there's a simple solution. And often the solution involves certain trade-offs. In fact, his own life involves that kind of trade-off. Putting reason first costs him all sorts of things in his personal life. It means he really can't have any sort of romantic relationships. It also means that he can't have many friends. Really, Watson is his only friend throughout the stories. In addition to that, you might say, it forces him to suppress certain parts of his personality, and that means that, for example, he becomes addicted to drugs. There are other problems. So Holmes has to make sacrifices in coming up with what he does. The second thing is he isn't always right. The cases aren't always solved. And so it's not as if there's always a solution. It's in that sense, too, that it's tragic. The hero has to make choices, sometimes has to suffer as a result of those choices, and in general can't always get it right. Sometimes just loses, and there's nothing that can be done about that.